picture of... Testing, testing. Okay, good evening. We're going to get the show on the road here. My name is Richard Drolet. I'm one of the co-founding members of the Southeast Mass Coalition for a Free Palestine. We want to start by thanking the First Unitarian Church and their staff for allowing us to use this space, which is a wonderful space. So we thank them profusely. And we also want to thank you folks who are taking the time out of your personal lives to come out and listen to this. A wonderful speaker talking about her book, her and Rami Corey's book. So anyway, and we're also going to have a moment of silence. First, we're going to have a moment of silence for, today is Trans Day of Remembrance. So I've been to a couple of these before. I didn't realize it was this time of the year. But anyway, so today is Trans Day of Remembrance. So can we have a moment of silence for that, please? Thank you. And we're also going to, before I introduce our speaker, one of the co-authors of the book, Ms. Helena Cobban, we want to take another moment of silence to face the fact that approximately, well, it's at least 200,000 people, basically, if not more, have either been murdered or wounded, and many times very seriously, by the Israeli government, by the IDF, and it's horrible. So we want to take a minute to just reflect upon that and what it means that our government is supporting that. Thank you very much. Tonight we have a wonderful chance to listen to Helena Cobban speak about her book and the role of resistance in the Palestinian liberation. By the way, her co-author and co-worker is Rami Corey, who couldn't make it here this evening. Apparently, they're in the middle of doing a book tour throughout the nation. So, anyway, she's gonna speak for whatever, and then we're gonna have a question and answer period, and we have cards. I'll go around with cards if anybody wants to ask a question and write it down, and give it to Kai, who's the facilitator. They can do that, or if you want to just wait until it's time, you raise your hand and Kai will recognize you and you can ask your question. And we've also written some questions up so that if it sounds like it's people aren't asking questions, we've picked some good questions that we can ask. A few notes on housekeeping. We're selling the book at the back, which most of you already know, but the cost of the book is $20 and you can buy it by cash or with Venmo. And then there's also a bucket back there for, what is it? Something World International?
Just World.
Just World International. Is it Just World International? No.
Education.
Just World Educational. I keep forgetting that name. Anyway, I've read it about 1 million times, but I'm sorry, I'm getting old. Anyway, so if you want to donate to that, there's a bucket back there, which used to be our Palestine bucket. We changed it to this for this meeting tonight. So, and that's going to help pay for the travel to and from Washington, D.C. She came all the way from Washington to speak at Cambridge, and because of the wonderful work of Mass Peace Action and Margaret Eichmann, we were able to get her to come down here and speak to us, so we're getting the benefit of that. So I want to thank both of them, the group and Margaret, for what they did. And there are 2 bags in the rear for trash. Just like I said, this is housekeeping. We have one bag is for bottles. We have plenty of bottled water back there, so one bag is for bottles. Then there's another black tub right in back of that post there, which is for trash. We have wonderful food, which was donated by a lot of people, but unfortunately one person who's not here that donated $70 toward the food is the widow of the man who helped make me the person that I am when it comes to thinking about Palestine. Dr. Nasir Rory changed my life with his teaching, and I'll never forget him, and I'll never forget the Palestinian people. Anyway, I also want to remind people at the end of, they can either raise their hands, as I mentioned earlier, and ask a question, or use one of the index cards provided so you can write down your question, and Kai will look at them and make sure that question gets asked. We also have 3 sign-up sheets in the rear. Most of you have already done that. We want to make sure we get let you know about events coming, because we are in the process of coming up with another 5, or maybe more, Palestinian movie theater movies, where we do at the Labor Council in New Bedford, allows us to use their hall for that. And we have some great films that are coming up. So, because there's been a lot of great work done, looking back and seeing what is actually going on. So, we expect the film series to probably start in January after the holidays. And the other event you can help out on is every Sunday. We've had to move it to Sunday now, but every Sunday morning from 11 in the morning to 12:15, we have a standout, and we hold signs for peace in the Middle East. No more war, stop arming Israel, enforce a total arms embargo against Israel, because obviously they don't take a hint very easily, and depending on who you listen to and what you believe, it's because this president doesn't really care. This president's fine with what Israel's doing, even though he claims he isn't. And some people will argue with me till tomorrow, but it's clear from his actions, he just doesn't care. When you say, that's a red line if they do this and you don't do anything, and then that's another red line if you do that, invade Rafah, the whole 9 yards, it just doesn't matter. Anyway, so the standouts are very important because, we had 7 people at the standout this past Sunday, and it doesn't look good if you got 7 people standing out there holding 3 banners and signs, but if we had 40 or 50 people, it would make a much bigger impact on people. And I ordered some new signs today which say, honk for a free Palestine, or honk for peace in Palestine, I think actually what it says. And those help by, people honk when they go by. What? Oh, it's at the corner of Faunt's Corner Road and State Road, or Route 6. So it's at the North Dartmouth Mall. So make sure that's where we used to be at Route 6 and 140. But now it's dark at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, so we can't go there anymore. I think that's pretty much it, but let me just check. Oh, the bathrooms are right through this door, and this gentleman over here at the end is going to help lead you there. Apparently there's some music going on in the other room, people practicing music and stuff, so we want to try to be quiet when we go, but the bathroom's right over there. He's going to lead you the way. Okay, without any further ado, I present to you Ms. Helena Cobban, the co-author of Understanding Hamas and Why That Matters. Thank you very much.
Hi, I want to thank Richard for that lovely introduction, and I want to thank all of you who came out on a cold evening. Well, I feel it's very cold because I'm from Washington, D.C., but I guess you guys are used to it. Okay, I'm going to bring the mic a little closer and speak a little louder. Wait. Okay, so the title of this talk deals mainly with the question of Palestinian resistance, and I personally I've had the honor of being able to interview and, in a sense, cross-examine and interact fairly closely and repeatedly with leaders of many Palestinian resistance organizations. First of all, because I was working as a journalist, including for the Christian Science Monitor in Beirut during the years 75 through 81. I had to leave in 81 because I had 2 small children. Didn't seem to be a good idea to be a war correspondent in a civil war. But then I came here to a school up in Cambridge, Massachusetts. It's not Haverford, its name, I can't remember the name. Anyway, so they gave me a fellowship to write a study of the PLO. And that's what brought me to this country, and I wasn't intending to stay, but here I am 42 years later. So, in the course of doing that work, I got to interview all the main leaders of the PLO, some of them a number of times. And of course, Palestinian resistance didn't start with the PLO. The resistance to my birth country, Britain, and its colonial rule in Palestine really erupted in a big organized way in the 1930s. And I think either today or yesterday was also the anniversary of the British killing of Izzeddin al-Qassam, who was the well-known Muslim sheikh who had organized that resistance in the 1930s. And of course, the British, like all colonial powers, used unbridled violence and many vile means of population control in order to end what turned out to be a 3-year Palestinian uprising in the 1930s. And that British repression kind of paved the way for when the Zionist organizations took advantage of many political factors in after the Second World War to undertake the next phase of their long-standing, decades-old project of taking over control of Palestine, as much of that as they could, which they did in the war of 1947 to 1949. And in the course of doing that, they ethnically cleansed from the areas that they controlled something like 85% of the Palestinians who were living there, and those were the people who became the refugees. So the next phase of Palestinian resistance to colonial rule and settler colonial implantation arose after the 1948 Nakba, and it arose primarily in Gaza in the first instance. Gaza has always, since 1948, been the crucible of Palestinian resistance because it is the place, first of all, it is within historic Palestine, and also it contains a very high concentration of Palestinian refugees from 1948, something like 75% of the population of Gaza is of refugee origin. And so that's where Fatah, which is the main, let's say, secular-ish resistance organization, arose in the early 1950s, and between Gaza and Cairo and Kuwait, because a lot of Palestinians were going to work in Kuwait, that's where they built their networks. So you can find all that in the book that I wrote when I was at Harvard, which is called The Palestinian Liberation Organization. Came out in 1984. And in the book, I predicted, 1984. In 1982, the Israelis had invaded Lebanon, big time. I mean, they did a smaller one in 78, but they did a big one in 82, with the goal of expelling the Palestinian armed groups who were in Lebanon at the time. And that's when Yasser Arafat and his colleagues from Fatah and the Popular Front and the Democratic Front were all forced to leave Beirut under an agreement brokered by the US government, which assured the PLO leaders of the well-being of the Palestinian civilians whom they were leaving behind. And within a month of that happening, we had the massacres at Sabra and Shatila refugee camps. So Honestly, there is no reason for Palestinians to take the word of the US government. I used to teach English in Shatila refugee camp to some girls, and I never even knew what happened to them, most of them. So anyway, now, okay, I need to back up, sorry, I've got so many things here I want to share with you. When I was writing about the PLO in the 1980s, it was demonized. You know, people would say, oh, you're a terrorist supporter. Oh, how could you possibly support, you know, the Munich Olympic Games massacre? You can't talk to those people. And I said, no, you do need to understand the roots and the mechanisms and the political dynamics of these anti-colonial resistance movements. I mean, I did grow up in England in the 1950s when, you know, routinely the Mau Mau in Kenya or other liberation movements would be portrayed in our media as the devil incarnate. And then suddenly you get up one day and there on the BBC, well, we didn't have a television, but on the radio, okay, you'd hear the British Governor General of Kenya. Okay, we need a graphic here. You'd see it in the newspapers. You'd see a picture of the British Governor General in his rather silly long shorts, hauling down the Union Jack in Nairobi and giving a good handshake to the new president of Kenya, who was Jomo Kenyatta, who, you know, 2 weeks before had been in jail and described broadly in the media as a terrorist. So, you know, that's how I grew up. It wasn't just Kenya. It was all over. Not all over, sadly, but, you know, many parts of the British Empire. That was the era of decolonization. And it is written into the United Nations that people who are colonized have the right to resist colonization, just as people who are under military occupation have the right to resist military occupation by all means necessary within the bounds of international law. I mean, you know, in terms of resisting military occupation, you talk to the Danes or the Norwegians or the French, and they know very viscerally how important that right to resist military occupation, including by military means, how important that is. So you have these two things going on. You have the United Nations saying, oh, people have the right to resist by all means necessary within the bounds of international humanitarian law. But you also have the fading colonial powers which demonize such resistance movements. And this is not new, I guess. That's what I want to say. It's not new. So in my 1984 book on the PLO, I predicted that after the expulsion of the PLO military formations from Lebanon, the center of gravity of the national movement would move from the diaspora Palestinians to those Palestinians still living in their homeland, between occupied Gaza, occupied West Bank, including occupied East Jerusalem, and perhaps also some of the Palestinians who had citizenship of Israel and are in 1948 Israel. But I definitely said it will move to the occupied territories. That book came out in 1984, and in December 1987, the first Intifada broke out. And where did it break out? It broke out in the territories occupied in 1967. So that was the birth of this new, intentionally Islamist resistance movement known as the Harakat al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya, Hamas. They're born like 2 days after the outbreak of the first Intifada, born in Gaza, but also in the West Bank. Always had like a strong center of gravity in Gaza, although actually, you know, for many years they had a greater degree of popular support in the West Bank than they had in Gaza, which we could discuss later, but anyway. Hamas was formed by the Palestinian branch of a broad region-wide organization called the Muslim Brotherhood. So there are branches of the Muslim Brotherhood throughout, I want to say all the Arab world, but in many Arab countries. And they are different in different places. They had been centered in Egypt, which of course has long had a close relationship with Gaza. And for many years prior to 1987, the Palestinian Muslim Brotherhood had been kind of quietist. You know, I'm a Quaker. I'm very familiar with the idea that in all religious denominations, there are people who think if you just sort of pray and seek to live a righteous life and raise righteous families, that is helping to bring justice. But then there are people who say, no, we got to go out and actually, you know, end slavery or whatever Quakers did. You know, and so there's kind of like both these trends inside Quakerism. Inside the Palestinian Muslim Brotherhood, the activist trend really came to the fore in December of 1987 when they founded this new movement. But it was based on many decades of the Muslim Brotherhood there having built relationships, established community institutions, focused on women's rights within Islam. For example, the mosques that they built, that Hamas and its predecessors built in Gaza, all have a separate floor, a whole floor for women's prayer. That hadn't happened before. They put a huge emphasis on women's education and professional advancement. I need to back up from that, but this is just one way in which it's very evident that Hamas is not like ISIS. Because people frequently say, you know, oh, if you support negotiating with Hamas or talking to Hamas, that's just like talking to ISIS. No. And, you know, we discussed this in the webinars on which our book was built to quite a degree. Another is the way that Hamas deals with people who are not, as they are, Sunni Muslims. I mean, if you are ISIS in Syria, in the north of Syria, and your neighbor is a Shiite or a Christian Syrian, then that neighbor is going to be slaughtered. In Palestine, it's very different. Hamas is not like that at all. It's worth noting that my longtime friend and colleague, Rami Khouri, who here knows what the word Khouri means? It means priest. He is from a Christian family with his origins in Nazareth. Rami and I, you know, both have a strong journalism background, but he is also a Palestinian nationalist, and he says quite openly that in his analysis right now, the organization that best represents the Palestinian national consensus is Hamas. You know, I have, as it happens, interviewed people in Hamas from every level, from like the grassroots, women doing community service projects, or running kindergartens, or doing church suppers. I gather there is a church supper here if you can stick around for long enough, but you have to listen to me first. And, you know, to the people who were running for parliament in 2006, to the national leaders. I mean, I've actually sat in a room with a group of 6 or 7 people from their leading Mejlis Ashura consultative council back when they were in Damascus, and you know, heard them talk about many political issues. So they were founded as a political movement in December of 1987, and successive leaders of Hamas have been have been assassinated by the Israelis since then, including in 2003, 2004, a whole, like Abdelaziz Rantisi, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, who was the founder of Hamas, Ismail Abu Shanab. They were just mown down by the Israelis. So the fact that the Israelis more recently have assassinated Ismail Haniyeh, who was the elected prime minister, elected in 2006 in free and fair parliamentary elections in the occupied territories, and they just, snuffed him out in Tehran, and then they killed Yahya Sinwar. Although they didn't, they killed him because he was fighting on the front lines. They didn't actually set out to assassinate him, but that's another story. But one of the reasons I mention this is because Hamas is very resilient as a political entity. It has built-in resilience because they know, they have this experience of their leaders having been assassinated. So they are always educating new ranks of leaders. They have a strong collective leadership. And it's important to understand these things because otherwise, the Israelis or their many shills in the US Congress might tell us, and I have to say in the Biden administration, might tell us, we just need, 7 weeks more of sending these big weapons and bombs and whatever, and then we can force Hamas to negotiate. We can end Hamas. We can destroy Hamas. It's not like that. I mean, maybe they should try talking to some people from, who lived through the Vietnamese resistance movement in the 1950s and 1960s, who took such pain, such community destruction from first the French and then the British. And they took it, and they persisted, and they won. So, what's happening to the people in Gaza today and in the West Bank and in Lebanon is just horrendous. But it's sort of justified by our political leaders on the basis that, just a few more bombs, just a few more missiles, just a few more weeks of starvation-ish kind of stuff, and they will cave. No. I mean, that's why I think of our book as being a radical plea for effective diplomacy. This thing has been negotiated in a partial way many times in the past, including exactly a year ago in November. How many of you remember the 4-day ceasefire that was successfully negotiated? It was extended for a further 2 days and then for a further 1 day. And in the course of those 7 days of ceasefire, I think 130 or maybe 150 Israeli hostages were released. It worked. But then they try and tell us, there's no way we can negotiate with Hamas. I mean, they want us to think up is down. They want us to believe in something that has been described as escalation to de-escalate. If we can just send in the more bombs and the more missiles, then we will force Hamas onto the ropes and they will negotiate. National liberation struggles are not like that. And it's as if these people in the Pentagon and in the Senate and in the House of Representatives and in the State Department have never studied history, including the history of the US in Vietnam. I guess that's kind of my elevator pitch for this book, is that both parts of the title are important. Understanding Hamas and why that matters. When you say understanding Hamas, the word understanding actually has two connotations. I can say, I understand how an electric vehicle battery works, you know? Well, maybe I don't. Okay, I can say I understand something, you know, scientific or technical like that. But if you talk about understanding a political movement, it means that. It means you understand how it works, what motivates it. But it can also mean, and in my view, it should also mean, having a degree of understanding for the people who built this political machine. I mean, I have a degree of sympathetic understanding to people who survived the Holocaust and wanted to find a place to go. And we can express that. But we're not allowed to express any degree of, let's say, emotional understanding for this organization that has been so thoroughly demonized that, you know, sometimes when I'm talking to people about how can we set up an event to talk about the book, this happened actually in the Bay Area recently. We did 6 wonderful events in the Bay Area with great local partners from local organizations, congregations, Jewish Voice for Peace, Presbyterian churches, others who co-sponsored the events. But some people said, oh, the H word, because it is kind of toxic in our culture right now. And people would far rather talk about, I mean, the stories coming from Gaza are so miserable, and the cruelty of the Israeli military people and their leaders, the cruelty and the gleeful way in which they advertise their cruelty is enough to make you weep, beyond weep. It makes me want to curl up in a ball. I don't know, but we cannot. We have to, you know, do what we can to end this carnage. And if we want to end the carnage, that means you need effective diplomacy, effective international action, not just at this stage to end the fighting and win the ceasefire, but also to end Israel's occupation of Gaza in the first instance. Because previously, over the last 17 years, the Israelis have launched periodic fierce assaults against Gaza, which killed, you know, hundreds of people, sometimes more than 2,000. They called them, obscenely, mowing the lawn. And then afterwards, there would be a ceasefire, negotiated with Hamas, by the way, indirectly through Qatar. And then there would be a massive donation of funds from Arab countries to go and rebuild Gaza. And how did that money, how did those construction materials get into Gaza? They went through Israel using, you know, Israeli ports, Israeli trucking companies, Israeli contractors. It was a wonderful profit center for the Israelis because Gaza has always been a captive economy as well as a captive society for them. So, you know, they got a lot of profit from testing out their new weapons against Gaza during each of these assaults. And then they made, and, you know, increasing the marketing of their weapons globally. And then they managed to make profit off the rebuilding. That has to end. That's just one reason why the occupation has to end. And obviously the UN General Assembly has called for the end within a year of the Israeli occupation of Gaza, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, the removal of all the Israeli settlers, and Israel to pay reparations to the Palestinians. I think that's not going to happen within a year, but I think within a year we could see, hopefully, the international community being steadfast enough against the US-Israeli assault on Gaza to force a ceasefire and the end of the Israeli occupation of Gaza. And then, great flotillas of aid can go in. They can rebuild a Gaza port. They can start to excavate that rubble that is intermixed with the shredded human remains of scores of thousands of our Palestinian brothers and sisters, and figure out a way to start to rebuild Gaza. But we're never going to get to that kind of a vision of ending the conflict so long as people can't talk about the Islamic resistance movement, Hamas, and its role in Palestinian politics. So it's not just in Gaza. That's number one. As I mentioned earlier, they have actually, by some measures, a greater degree of support in the West Bank than they have in Gaza, but they also have a huge degree of support in Jordan and in Lebanon and in the Gulf, because there are a lot of Palestinians in all those places. And it's not just a military organization. I mean, the way that they talk about it, it's like, we can subdue Hamas on the battlefield. And then what happens to the families, to the communities, to the governance of Gaza, in this case Gaza, but also potentially the West Bank? I mean, right now, the newspapers are full of the fact that gangs, some of them affiliated with ISIS, have been hijacking hundreds, or at least 800 or more, trucks of aid that need to go to the people of Gaza. And so the reason that aid has been distributed at all until now is because of the civilian police, the civilian, the governorate of Gaza City, the governorate, the civil authorities there, all of which have been closely affiliated with Hamas. So, I mean, Hamas does so many different things, is what I want to say, including women's education, supporting women in political and public life. When they had those elections in 2006, 4 of the Hamas people who were elected to the Palestinian parliament were women, and I got to interview a couple of them. One of them became a minister, Dr. Jamila Shanti. She was just, a really wonderful kind of down-to-earth woman. She was a university professor of social work, and I think it was the Department of Social Work that she ran for the government. She was killed by the Israelis last December because they want to attack all the Umud, how do you say, the pillars of Palestinian society, like my late friend Dr. Rifat al-Arir, whom they murdered on December 6th of last year, who was a professor of English literature at the Islamic University of Gaza. I'm actually bringing out, my publishing company is bringing out a memorial edition of his favorite book in December, so guys should watch for that. I've kind of leapt through this all a little bit. I mentioned the elections. So the Oslo process was what Bill Clinton succeeded in bringing about in September of 1993. I was actually on the White House lawn. It was weird. But he succeeded in co-opting, in essence, the Fatah and the secular Palestinians and turning them into sort of quislings for the Israeli occupation. And it was a very painful process to watch. Hamas opposed the Oslo process, but there was, so under Oslo there was this kind of whole structure of it was called the Palestinian Interim Self-Governing Authority. So it was only ever meant to be an interim. It was meant to have a 5-year term. But they created like a presidency and a parliament. And Hamas didn't run in either of those elections in 1996, but they did allow the elections to go ahead. They just said, we're not running, but if you guys want to run, you do it. In 2006, after the death of Yasser Arafat, there was seen to be a need for a new round of elections, both for the president and for the parliament in this Palestinian interim self-governing authority. And this time, Hamas decided to run in the elections for the parliament, not for the presidency. Those elections were held in January 2006, and Hamas won them roundly. I mean, it was kind of a huge shock for Condoleezza Rice and the rest of the Bush administration and the Israelis, and especially for Fatah. Possibly similar to the shock many of us had recently when Donald Trump won, but very different politics, so let's not go there. So they won, and they said, we don't want to run the government, because it's sort of a quasi-parliamentary system where you have a president and a prime minister. They said, we don't want to be the prime minister. We want to be part of a national unity government with Fatah. And Fatah, which had been by then on the US-Israeli payroll for more than 10 years, said, oh, no, we don't want to be in a national unity government. So the Fatah people and the US and their US-Israeli handlers prepared a coup against Hamas, which they tried to undertake. Well, they were planning to undertake it in 2007. That failed, and that is the origin of the separation. You had a Hamas administration in Gaza and a Fatah administration in the West Bank. And, honestly, it's classic divide and rule. So when successive Israeli governments felt that Washington was putting pressure on them to give something to the Ramallah government, to the Fatah PA people, they would sort of build up support for the Hamas government in Gaza, playing one off against the other. There were many in both of those organizations, in both Hamas and Fatah, who said, no, we cannot be part of this divisive, cruel, imperial divide and rule. And the ones who were strongest in urging the formation of a national unity government were the prisoners from both organizations, and especially from Fatah, Marwan Barghouti, who has been in prison for 20-some years at this point, a Fatah guy. And actually, I think Hamas still wants Marwan Barghouti of Fatah to be the head of the national unity government. But of course, in the meantime, we've had all kinds of other terrible things going on. But so after they won the elections, and they consolidated their control in Gaza, that's when you had the siege from 2007 onwards. Gaza has been under very tight siege, and with those mowing the lawn things happening. So I think I will just recap quickly, and then we're going to have Q&A, and I really do welcome your most probing questions. Happy to talk about this topic for a long time. Of course, the book is here. It's based on these 5 webinars that my organization, Just World Educational, presented back in May. And I have to say I'm really pleased with the way it came out, because Rami, my co-host, and we made the decision in Just World Ed board to do this in late March, and then we put these 5 webinars on throughout May. So we pulled it together at very short notice, but with a kind of a concept that this should be kind of pedagogically sound and accessible to non-specialists. That's the main thing. You know, a lot of wonderful people have written a lot of wonderful books about Hamas, but they're not really written for a non-specialist reader. So in our webinars, you know, we kind of we assumed that the attendees in the webinars really didn't know much about Hamas, but perhaps they were interested. And we had wonderful participation, and they're still available on YouTube. You can go and see them. But then, and we tried like each week to build on some of the knowledge that people had gotten the previous week. And when we put the transcripts together into the book, it actually, I think it by and large does work. There is a little bit of repetition, but you know, repetition is pedagogically sound, you know, provided it sort of builds on from one stage to another. And then we also put in some documentation and readers' aids that will make the book accessible. The goal is for it to be accessible to non-specialists, so that people, you know, at whatever public gathering or in conversations with friends or family around the Thanksgiving dinner table or whatever, and somebody says, "Ooh, Hamas," that a non-specialist can say, well, actually, Hamas is quite a lot more interesting than you thought. Did you know that? And, you know, and they can draw on the kind of knowledge that we give people in this book. And obviously, we hope you'll go on and read a lot of other fine books on Hamas afterwards. But it's fine if you don't, you know, because as general interest readers, people need to know some basic facts, how they developed politically, the difference between the 1988 charter and the 2017 charter, the way they describe what their goals were on October 7th, 2023. All of this stuff, I think you'll find it in the book. And, you know, Rami and I are quite adamant that we don't support Hamas. Well, I have no, you know, I'm not a Palestinian. It's not my role. But what we want to do is we want our readers to understand how the organization works and where its supporters and leaders are coming from and what their vision of the future is and how they want to work with other Palestinian movements and how they want to, you know, achieve national liberation. So anyway, that's the quick pitch for the book. I'm happy to answer questions. I'm going to descend from the heights and do that. Okay, thanks. I completely forgot about that step. Oh well.
Can everybody hear me? First of all, I want to say thank you so much to Helena for this incredibly informative talk. We're now going to open the floor up to question and answer session. So folks can feel free to raise their hand if they have a question, and we'll call on you. This is the only mic that we have, so we might ask you to just raise your voice when you ask the question, and I can always repeat it so that everyone can hear. Yes.
Hi. I'd like to ask you about 20 different things. I'll go with the one that first occurred to me. I think I heard you say that you expect that within a year, the international community will make, correct me if I'm misquoting or misremembering, will start making progress towards ending the occupation, ceasefire,
Yeah, that's a great question. Look, part of this is hope. We have to have hope. But part of it is my analysis that I've been pursuing for a number of years now into the nature of the U.S. position in the world. You know, right after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the U.S. enjoyed more than 2 decades of hegemony over the world system. And that has been eroding over the past decade to a large extent, including a degree of de-dollarization, including the rise of the BRICS as a counterpoint to the US-led G7. I think ending the occupation of Gaza within a year is a realistic goal if the international community can come together around that and use economic means to impose their will on the US. And so long as, like, Trump is in power, I don't think either Trump or Netanyahu are poised to make friends globally. So it may be a question that this will help to bring about the crumbling of US hegemony in this important respect. But it's a long shot to do it within a year. But God, how many people will still be alive in Gaza at the end of another 12 months? How many people in Gaza will still be alive at the end of this winter? So we have to have hope.
We have another question here in front.
Thank you very much for your presentation. My question is going to be a little murky, but I think we can sort it out. What do you see as the role of Christian nationalism, Christian Zionism, and white supremacy right now in terms of how this has been evolving, in terms of what motivated my question is how this year a number of papers have been written about how the Ashkenazi of Israel are projecting themselves as white Europeans, and in this country, Christian nationalists who also claim to be Christian Zionists are seeing their role as supporters of this peace. And now, who Trump is now appointed as, who was going to appoint as the ambassador to Israel, is very much a white supremacist, clearly a white supremacist. All of that kind of jumbled together, kind of react to it.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about the role of a white supremacist Christian, which I put in air quotes, movement that is desperately trying to increase US involvement in Israel's genocide in Gaza. So we have, Mike Huckabee, the presumed nominee for ambassador to Israel. We have this guy, Pete Hegseth, who has Crusader crosses and Nazi stuff tattooed all over himself. To me, I mean, I'm a Quaker. I grew up in the Anglican Church. I had actually, I have to say, a little kind of segue through being a Unitarian. But I'm very much in the Christian tradition, and I have been a great beneficiary of white settler colonialism in this country and elsewhere. So I think we have a special responsibility, those of us in the churches, to combat that vision that distortion of the teachings of Jesus, recognizing that this country here was built by, a massive settler colonial project that was undertaken in the name of Christianity and the name of white supremacy. So we need to combat these. We need to examine this history in a very stark way if we are to be effective in solidarity. So Christianity, of course, was founded by somebody who was a Palestinian Jew from Nazareth. And he had so many wonderful teachings, and we need to reconnect with those and question this reliance on militarism, this reliance on brute force. I think internationally we will have allies, but obviously right now it looks pretty miserable in this country, given what Trump is doing, but also, for goodness sake, what Harris and Biden have done for the past 13 months, if not the past 5 years. I mean, when Biden came in, he could have, and in my view should have, immediately reversed Trump's earlier decisions to recognize the annexation of Jerusalem and Golan and to withdraw from the JCPOA with Iran. Biden could have done that on day one. He did not. And we have seen him over recent months proclaim himself to be a proud Zionist. And we saw him last week and this week saying that, all these reports from international agencies about Israel impeding humanitarian aid and everything else, that doesn't prevent him from sending additional arms. I mean, he had that 30-day window trick. He could have, at the end of it, said, and therefore we have concluded that we're going to, either cease or radically reduce our transfer of arms. He didn't. He chose not to. And he has chosen more recently to escalate against Russia. I mean, it's terrifying to me that Biden and Harris have bought into the militarist agenda against Russia and against the Palestinians.
Peter?
I wasn't surprised. It's a different story. I wasn't surprised about that they're taking the position that they're taking. It's the way that they can control. That way the parties can control the party for now. As long as I've been left. So I wasn't at all surprised that Biden and Harris are taking that position. But I'd like to understand Hamas a little bit better than I do. So maybe if you could help. So what is it that Hamas, what's the political program that they did? What were they doing in the communities in Gaza in the 2000s and the 1900s that was different than what Fatah did, that was different than what the PFLP did, and gained such popularity amongst the people of Palestine? So what is, I guess, what is the political program that they ran? And not just the political program, what did they say to the Palestinian people that they would do to uplift them economically when they ran, and what was their party program when they ran? And are there resources that we can reach out to as English speakers to learn to understand Hamas a little bit better?
Great question. So, resistance to foreign military occupation or to colonialism takes many forms, of which military resistance is just one. Talk to the Viet Cong, talk to the Mau Mau, talk to anybody who's, or the Maquis in France. you don't just do military operations. In fact, that's just like a small part of what you do. So what Hamas had been doing in the community, similar to what the Palestinian Muslim Brotherhood had been doing prior to the 1987 establishment of Hamas, was a lot of just community resilience. You know, you're living under a military occupation, life is hard, you run soup kitchens, you do education programs, you have preschools so that women can finish their degrees or you know, go out to work as teachers. You do quite a lot of religious education so that when times are really tough, people have a strong grounding in morals in a religious way. You share things. So what was distinctive that they were doing in the 1990s and 2000 was all of those things continued. But they also, well, they had a strong vision of liberation of Palestine from the river to the sea, but over time came to accept the idea that if a two-state solution could be a way station on the road to that, and if the majority of the Palestinian people agreed with that, then they would be happy to go along with it. And you can read that in their 2017 document. I think one of the main reasons that they succeeded in the 2006 elections was they were not corrupt. Fatah has been known, I mean, even, well, certainly since its leaders went back to the occupied territories in 1994 on the US payroll after Oslo, it's just a mess of corruption. And, you know, contracts and your cousin and my son and, you know, we'll do business and I've got this, you know, great Israeli scheme to do this and that in the West Bank. Hamas has a very, very good reputation as being clean and having this collegial leadership. So you don't have one person who signs off on all the contracts. Then they also work with other organizations. Right now in Gaza, they're working with the PFLP and the DFLP and organizations that are openly leftist/secular. That's what they do. You know, they have a very good record for working with other organizations. Right now in Gaza, they have a joint operations room, whereas in Fatah, I mean, for me, it was kind of really a tragic story to follow what happened to Fatah and its leaders from the time that I was interviewing them for the book in the early, mid-'80s, and then after Oslo. And what happened in the interim there was that they had also had a collegial leadership, and the three main people in that collegial leadership were Arafat and Abu Jihad, Khalil Wazir, and Abu Iyad, Salah Khalaf. Both of those latter leaders were assassinated. Abu Jihad was killed by the Israelis in 1988 in Tunis, and Abu Iyad was killed by probably the Iraqis in Cairo in 1991. So you just had Arafat, who I had always viewed as an excellent tactician, but a man without any strategy or understanding of strategy, and very vainglorious. I mean, the idea that he would get stamps that represent his picture, or that he would get a Nobel Peace Prize. I mean, it just really went to his sense of his self. And so he had a late marriage and one daughter, but he surrounded himself. When I say a late marriage and one daughter, what I mean is that I'm sure that the girl whose name is Zahra and her mother did all kinds of deals, but they weren't big-time deal makers. But he had surrounded himself with other deal makers, including Abu Mazen, who is, this tottering old guy who is supposedly the head of the PA right now. So, there was a clear, in the elections of 2006, there was a very clear distinction between the two. Hamas negotiated in the course of 2005 in great detail with the Israelis and the Americans how they could participate in this parliamentary election, which they did in a free and fair way, as the Carter Center and the EU all attested that the elections were free and fair. And they managed to reach people with their message. So I don't know, maybe that's answered your question a little bit. So in our book, first of all, if you've read the book, go to the bibliography. We have a lot of wonderful resources in the bibliography.
So we'll go to the next question. I did get a request from those watching the live stream for me to repeat the question. So Jeff, you can go ahead, and then I'll repeat it, and then we'll have Helena answer.
Hi, thank you so much. I was wondering if you could speak to the Hamas's goals with October 7th and some of the pressures that I'm forced or encouraged them to make such a drastic choice that they can make it, backlash from Israelis.
Yes, definitely. So the question was, what were some of Hamas's goals and motivations behind October 7th, 2023? And could you speak a little bit to their motivations?
Yeah, this is a really important question because there has been a whole industry that the Israeli government and its many shills in this country have generated all these, the 40 beheaded babies or the mass rapes or whatever. And these kind of accusations are just widely repeated in the general, in the mainstream media, as if they are gospel truth. They are not. And that has been debunked to a large extent by people like Max Blumenthal and Asa Winstanley and Electronic Intifada. And we have a lot of those materials are linked to in our bibliography. So the way that they themselves, the Hamas leadership, describe what they were doing on October 7th was that their goal was to undertake a very daring military operation, in order to capture as many Israeli military officers and serving men and women as possible, to take them back to Gaza to use as hostages in a release, because there were, at that point, I think about 7,500 Palestinian political prisoners. And, there was a precedent for this. There are several precedents for this, including Gilad Shalit, who was an Israeli soldier who was exchanged for, I think, 1,200 Palestinians back in the day, including Yahya Sinwar. I think that was the exchange in which he was freed. So that was their goal. And in order to do that, hang on, I'm going to move across so that I can see you. In order to do that, they had to break out of the concentration camp that Gaza had become. I'm sorry. Thank you so much, Tonia. So the concentration camp was enclosed by high walls, punctuated by watchtowers that had automatic weapons. And when I say automatic weapons, I don't mean like an AR-15. I mean a weapon that if it detects motion, it fires automatically without anybody having to pull any trigger. And which swept a whole area of 200 yards to the west of the wall. So what the Hamas military people had figured out was how to completely neutralize, immobilize, and paralyze that whole system. And, I mean, they used paragliders, they used all kinds of stuff, but they knew exactly where to go, and they went not only to the head of the headquarters of the Gaza Brigade, but they also went to the headquarters of the Israeli military's entire southern command, and in both of those headquarters, they were able to enter, and if there were sentries on duty, they must have been, like asleep or whatever, and they were able to capture very senior officers, as well as serving men and women from both these major Israeli military command headquarters, as well as the one near the Erez checkpoint, which was another large one. So, because they had completely collapsed the wall system that surrounded the concentration camp, people were able to take like bulldozers and just like make breaches in what remained of the wall. I think the wall was breached in maybe 40 or 50 places, which, given that it's only like 36 kilometers long, there were a lot of breaches in the wall. And the people who'd been living in that concentration camp under tight siege for 17 years poured out. And they just, went, Hayella, let's go here, let's go there. Oh my goodness, we can steal this children's bike. We can, have fun on this on this skateboard. We can go back to, my grandmother's farm, which she always told me was exactly there. And there were a few things Hamas did wrong on October 7th. One was they did not police the border. And it would have been hard, given that they're a liberation movement, and the whole ethos of the refugees in Gaza is return to the ancestral lands, which they had tried to do in 2018 with the Great March of Return in a mass non-violent series of demonstrations, and suffered horribly. So now, finally, all these people who were like very focused on returning to my grandfather's farm poured out, and there was no discipline, because Hamas and the other groups that were in that coalition operation were very focused on, we go to the military base, we do what we have to in military terms to get into the base and to capture our captives, our military captives, and take them back, which they did. Very high military people, and some just serving men and women, including the young women who are still in captivity in Gaza, were spotters in the military. So the kind of, well, you can call, the hoi polloi of Gaza, some people call them the riffraff of Gaza, but I think that's not. So just the general people of Gaza who flooded out had the general idea that the idea is to take hostages. So they did, they took people from the rock concert. They took people from here, from there. Which is why you ended up with a lot of civilian hostages scattered throughout Gaza. And the Hamas central organizing people had no idea where they were. So actually gathering them together in the November ceasefire of last year was a real achievement for them to find which family, which clan had, 3 women from here or a family from there, and they gathered them and were able to exchange them. Nearly all of the civilian hostages were exchanged. There are a handful that were not. So, I've described this from very soon after as they had this very daring operation, and it was a catastrophic success. Catastrophic because for the Israeli military and its subsidiary national community, I mean, Israel is a military with a national community attached. This was an existential blow. I mean, they based their whole self-concept on the idea that they can deter anything. I mean, deterrence is a horrible, bullying way to be in the world when it's military. And here they were, they had been one-upped by, 15,000, 20,000 people from Gaza. And they had lost their entire ability to operate militarily in the south of their country. So that's why they reacted in this horrendously violent way on the day itself and over the days that followed with the use of the Hannibal Doctrine, and every single day since then, because they want to reestablish their deterrence. They thought that they had Hamas contained. And my friend Tarek Bakroni has written a book called Hamas Contained. But Hamas was not contained and had a plan that led to where we are.
Thank you so much for that thorough breakdown, and I really also appreciated you touching on the point of the media's role in all of this, especially publications like the New York Times really manufacturing consent for this genocidal war, as they have done in the past. And you mentioned some of your colleagues at the Electronic Intifada. If folks aren't reading that site or consulting it for news, for understanding of what's going on, I really have to recommend it very highly. So in the interest of time, I think we can take 1 or 2 more questions, especially if there's someone who hasn't yet posed a question. If not, I will come back to you, David. Okay, we'll go to you. So just to resume the question overall, is how would Helena react to the reports that came out regarding the fact that Netanyahu and the Israeli government had some sort of intelligence or were aware of the plans for the effective prison break on the 7th of October, 2023? I guess, is there legitimacy in those claims? How does that relate to Israel's callousness towards human life more generally.
That was a great précis. So I would say I have not seen any accounts in the Israeli media that I read that would indicate that degree of callousness. What I would say I've seen is a lot of accounts that some of these young women spotters in the military had been raising an alarm for some weeks or possibly months prior to October 7th. Oh, they seem to be doing this. Because, they had drones, they had all kinds of surveillance, and I think there were reports that these spotters had identified, oh, it looks as though they're preparing to take hostages. Oh, and they sent those reports up the chain of command, but these were just, young women spotters, and it didn't fit in with the overweening sense of self-confidence that the high-ups in the military had, who probably just said, oh, poo-poo, we have Hamas contained, and there was also a bias in the Israeli military high command toward two other tasks. One was a real shift of resources to helping the settlers in the West Bank and away from, really doing good recce around Gaza. And the other, that Yoav Gallant and the chiefs of staff and defense ministers for a long time have been preparing for a big attack on Hezbollah. I mean, if you recall, right after October 7th, Yoav Gallant said, now we've got to strike Lebanon, And at that time, I think Biden held him back, but Netanyahu enacted a typical protection racket and said, oh, Biden, we know you're worried about the possible regional consequences of an attack on Lebanon. We will hold back from attacking Lebanon if you let us do what we like in Gaza. And I mean, that's definitely been a constant thing, but I know the IDF High Command has been a long time planning for what they call the big war against Hezbollah. So now we have all of it, and, attacks against Iran as well, and Donald Trump. I think we just need to pray and be active and hold up for human rights as best we can.
I think that's a beautiful note to end on, leave us all with a little bit of hope and also hopefully some more resilience and determination to fight as much as we can. I think it's also been clear the role that the US plays in all of this, especially as a settler colonial country. So I think we have a lot of responsibility as well. Thank you so much, Helena, for being here with us today. It's been a pleasure to listen to you and learn from you. And on behalf of the Southeastern Mass Coalition for a Free Palestine, we want to thank you all so much for being here. There are copies of Helena and Rami's book for sale right in the back there. There is also food as well.
And we love donations for Just World Educational because we are a tiny little organization, small but feisty. I think because nobody else wanted to touch this issue, we did. We decided last March to do it, but it all costs a lot of money, and we have other plans going forward. So pony up, please, and recommend the book, to your book groups, or go onto Amazon, please, and give it good reviews there, because the trolls have already been out, saying that this is just a terrorist, whatever. So any help you can give, much appreciated. Thanks. guys make me feel almost like Netanyahu.